Good afternoon, boys and girls. Mr. Powell again with some more Civil War action here. Basically, today we're just going to talk about the election of 1864. Just because there's a war on, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be an election. So we started pretty much with 1860, the election of 1860, and now we've got another election coming up. So the breakdown of this in terms of people is you got Abraham Lincoln for the Republicans. Pretty much he's the first Republican president. And who's going to be the Democrat that runs against him? Well, you're going to recognize this guy. It's someone we've met before. It's our old buddy, George Brinton McClellan, who, if you remember, was one of the first generals in charge of the Army of the Potomac, the second general in charge of the Army of the Potomac. He's going to run as the Democrat candidate for president. Funny fact, I think his wife's name was Ellen McClellan. It's a little weird. Anyway, of course, the main issues make parties. Issues are the determining factors for elections, stuff like that. But the two real big ones here are war and the race issue that's emerging as an issue in American politics, more so than ever before. So in terms of the war, for Lincoln and the Republicans, they're looking for a military victory. They will only accept a military victory. They're going to prosecute the war to the end, no matter what. Over here on the Democrat side, they're a little bit more loose about that. They want to have a negotiated peace. And there's definitely fault lines in the Democrat Party about how this is supposed to take place. They have differences within their own party about how to approach this. There was what was called war Democrats and peace Democrats, but they were not really as hardcore about fighting the war to its conclusion, winning the war, as Lincoln and the Republicans were, whether you were a war Democrat or a peace Democrat. Also, there's the race issue. So you've got Abraham Lincoln with the Emancipation Proclamation, and then you've got the Democrats, who are in a lot of ways very sympathetic to the South. So they don't really support this Emancipation Proclamation. They're probably the more anti-black, you could say, of the two parties. The Emancipation Proclamation was a very prickly sort of political issue when Abraham Lincoln initiated that proclamation that said all the slaves in the slave states are free once they get loose from their owners, their Confederate owners. That wasn't necessarily popular, even for people who were Republicans, or even for people who were soldiers in the ranks that are wearing the blue uniforms and actually doing the hard work of freeing people who were slaves. They may have not liked the Confederacy or anything that the Confederacy stood for, but they might not have been so pro freedom in terms of people who were former slaves. So this race issue was something that the Democrats hoped to exploit in 1864 and try and use that to drive a wedge into the Republican Party and kind of split people and get some over to their side. Also, you've got these guys who ultimately end up being I guess you could say the Democrats who took over, the peace Democrats. This was kind of their quote or their mantra: the Union as it was, the Constitution as it is. So the Union as it was, what's that mean? Well, that means that there's still slavery, basically. The Constitution as it is, that's a reference to their belief that Abraham Lincoln had overstepped his authority in the Constitution, that he was becoming sort of like a tyrant or a dictator. And you think that's a little weird almost, because Abraham Lincoln is lionized today. Abraham Lincoln is on the penny. He's on the $5 bill. There's that big memorial for Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C., if you ever go down to there. But a lot of people hated Lincoln's guts, even in the North. And obviously, he got murdered, right? So there's some people that didn't like him right there. But despite those sort of like oddballs that went after him physically, but a lot of people couldn't stand him. And here's some of the reasons right here. I kind of wrote him in lowercase letters because they're not really the big issues like war and race were the big issues. But subsidiary issue is the draft. Does the government have the power to sort of like enslave you and make you a soldier and have you go fight the war? That caused a lot of problems, like riots, huge riots where people were killed, things like that. An income tax. They had to create an income tax for this war because it was so expensive. An income tax was basically prohibited in the Constitution. Tell your parents that. I bet they'll be kind of happy and chuckle, or maybe chuckle in a sort of sad, ironic way. But there was no income tax in the original Constitution. You weren't allowed to do it. They temporarily did it for this war, and then they stopped doing it until early in the 20th century. They made an amendment to the Constitution, and then you could do an income tax for the government. And also greenbacks. This is similar to this is like the money we have today. Greenbacks is another word for dollars, essentially. But back then they had a much more chaotic and decentralized form of money. Sure, there was U.S. money, but there was money that was just issued by banks. So maybe in certain localities there would be certain forms of money that would be passed, like monopoly money type stuff that, you know, if you could use it in Illinois, but if you take it to New York, you wouldn't really get anything for it. So they kind of had a standardized system of greenbacks that they put in place, again, for expediency of the war. So this is all stuff that, you know, subsidiary to the war and the huge race issue that the Democrats had problems with. So I was gonna read a couple things here from my huge book, Battle Cry of Freedom. Almost done reading it, but not quite. So, just to set this up, the war, it doesn't really look like it's going to be a good election for Lincoln in 1864, early 1864. Things aren't necessarily going really well. It's been, 3-ish years of war. Haven't really won yet. People are getting restless. The body count's growing. And then things start to go well for the Union militarily, specifically the fall of Atlanta in late summer of 1864. That victory practically guaranteed that Abraham Lincoln was going to win the election of 1864. If Sherman did not capture Atlanta in 1864, or he got stymied or beaten somehow, it's doubtful that Abraham Lincoln would have won. It seemed like it was really that close. Ultimately, I wouldn't say it was, or it didn't turn out that way, but in early 1864, who knew this? So, quick passage here. Far to the north, George B. McClellan digested the news of Atlanta as he wrote his letter accepting the Democratic nomination. If he endorsed the platform or said nothing about it, he would by implication commit himself to an armistice and negotiations. McClellan felt great pressure from the party's peace faction to do just that. Do not listen to your Eastern friends, Vallandigham implored him. It's another Democrat, Vallandigham, who in an evil hour may advise you to insinuate even a little war into your letter of acceptance. If anything implying war is presented, 200,000 men in the West will withhold their support. Early drafts of McClellan's letter would have satisfied Vallandigham. They endorsed an armistice, qualified only by a proviso, calling for renewed war if negotiations failed to produce reunion. But McClellan's Eastern friends, the War Democrats, including the banker August Belmont, chairman of the Democratic National Committee, convinced him that if once stopped, the war could not be started again. An armistice without conditions would mean surrender of the Union. After Atlanta, such a proposal would stultify his candidacy. So McClellan's letter, released on September 8th, repudiated the 4 years of failure plank. I could not look in the faces of gallant comrades of the Army and the Navy and tell them that their labor and sacrifice of our slain and wounded brethren had been in vain, he wrote. No, when our present adversaries are ready for peace on the basis of union, negotiations could begin in a spirit of reconciliation and compromise. The Union is the one condition of peace. We ask no more. The one condition of peace. So that would mean something like, say, slavery. If the Confederates in the South said, well, we'll be back in the Union, but we got to still have slavery, he would say, yeah. I'm just kind of breaking that down for you. I continue. Peace Democrats fumed that McClellan had betrayed them. They held hurried meetings to consider nominating another candidate, but nobody seemed to want the dubious honor, and the revolt subsided. Most Peace Democrats, including Vallandigham, eventually returned to the fold, although they campaigned mainly for the party platform rather than for McClellan. All right, so they're not really too enthusiastic about their candidate over on the Democrat side because it's McClellan. But I'm going to read you guys another quick passage here from this book, and it's going to talk more about like the election, how the election turned out, and all that. So this is from a little bit further on in the book here. War-weary rebel soldiers hoped fervently for McClellan and peace. The enemy are exceedingly anxious to hold out until after the presidential election, reported Grant from the Petersburg front. Deserters come into our lines daily who tell us that the men are nearly universally tired of war, and that desertions will be much more frequent, but they believe peace will be negotiated after the fall elections. Such sentiments provoked opposite feelings among Union soldiers. Although many leading officers of the Army of the Potomac were still McClellanized, according to a general in another Union army, most men in the ranks no longer favored their former commander. Not that the soldiers dislike the man so much as the company he keeps, end quote, wrote one enlisted man. Quote, there are a good many soldiers who would vote for McClellan, but they could not go for Vallandigham, end quote. A Democratic triumph would mean inglorious peace and shame, the old truckling subserviency to the Southern domination, declared an officer in the Iron Brigade. Quote, I'd rather stay out here a lifetime, much as I dislike it, wrote another soldier, a former Democrat, than consent to a division of our country. We all want peace, but none any but an honorable one, end quote. Many Union soldiers had a chance to register their opinions at the ballot box. Here was a bold experiment in democracy, allowing fighting men to vote in what amounted to a referendum on whether they should continue fighting. But as Grant put it, they are American citizens and they have as much right to vote as those citizens who remain at home. Nay more, for they have sacrificed more for their country. By 1864, 19 states had enacted provisions for soldiers to vote in the field. Of the states that had not, the three most important were Indiana, Illinois, and New Jersey, where Democratic legislatures had blocked the measure. Although much rhetoric about proconsular rule and Caesarism had accompanied this opposition, the true reason was the recognition by Democrats that the Army had become overwhelmingly Republican, or at least pro-Union, as the Republican Party styled itself in 1864. 12 of the states allowing absentee voting provided for separate tabulation of soldier ballots. Lincoln received 119,754 of them to McClellan's 34,291, a majority of 78 for the president, compared to with 53% of the civilian vote in those states.
So he won most of the soldier votes by far. The absentee soldier vote majority for Republicans in the other 7 states was probably at least as great. Of the states that did not permit absentee voting, the contest was particularly close and important in Indiana. As commander-in-chief, the president could help along his cause there, and did not shrink from doing so. The loss of Indiana to friends of the government, Lincoln wrote to General Sherman in Atlanta, would go far towards losing the whole Union cause. So the president would be pleased if the general could furlough as many Indiana soldiers as possible to go home and vote. Several thousand soldiers did get to go to Indiana and vote. The War Department also combined military hospitals for convalescent Indiana soldiers well enough to travel. Some members of a Massachusetts regiment temporarily stationed in Indiana may have added to their votes to Republican total there. In none of the states with separately tabulated soldier ballots did this vote change the outcome of the presidential contest. Lincoln would have carried all of them except Kentucky in any case. But in 2 close states where soldier votes were lumped in with the rest, New York and Connecticut, these votes may have provided the margin of Lincoln's victory. The men in blue also decided the outcome in several congressional districts, and the votes of Maryland soldiers for a state constitutional amendment abolishing slavery more than offset the slight majority of the home vote against it. Lincoln's popular vote majority of 500,000 translated into an electoral count of 212 to 21. That's a total drubbing right there. Lincoln massacred McClellan. The president won all the states but Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey. His party also captured control of the governorships and legislatures of all those states. The next Congress would have a Republican Party of 3/4. The similarity between the Union vote of 1864 and the Republican vote of 1860 in the northern states was remarkable. Lincoln received virtually the same 55% from the same regions and constituencies within these states that he had received 4 years earlier. Republicans continued to draw their greatest support from native-born and British Protestant farmers, skilled workers, white-collar voters, especially in New England and the greater New England of the upper north. Democrats remained strongest among unskilled workers, immigrant Catholics, and butternuts, which is their word that they used for like poor farmers in the lower Midwest and the southern Midwest, as the Union Party of Republicans expanded their base beyond 1860 in the border states, including West Virginia, where they won 50% of the vote, compared with 9% in 1860, and drew most of their support from urban middle class and prosperous non-slaveholding farmers. Democrats retained the slaveholders, immigrants, and poorer farmers. So that's the election of 1864 right there. Lincoln wins. Pretty big. Democrats were able to get much more of the immigrant vote. Poor farmers, those kind of guys, would vote Democrat. The soldiers voted more for Lincoln, and people in the upper north, like I guess you could say New England kind of areas, voted mostly for Lincoln. So that's basically the breakdown of the 1864 election right there. I think that's going to be all for today, and I'll have something else out for you this week for you guys to do. Thanks. Bye.